Welcome to the Drawing Room Detectives, where mystery meets imagination, and every case invites you to think just a little deeper. Today, we step once again into the fog-laced streets of Victorian London, into a tale not found in the original canon, but written in the true spirit of appreciation for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In this Sherlock Holmes mystery, we encounter a man who claims not only to understand Holmes, but to be him. Get comfortable, pour yourself a cup of tea, and prepare for the curious case of the shapeshifter's letter. And before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It's always a pleasure to see how far the game has spread. Chapter 1. The letter arrives. It was a brisk March morning when I found myself once again seated opposite my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes at our familiar table by the fireplace in Baker Street. Outside, the fog loitered with uncommon persistence, smearing the windows and muffling the passing hooves of hansom cabs like some conspiratorial veil over London's daily bustle. Holmes was, as usual, already engaged in his singular routine, curled in the depths of his armchair with a Turkish cigarette between his fingers and a pile of correspondence on his lap. He had, I noted, discarded his dressing gown in favour of a stiff collar and waistcoat, a detail that told me some small case or curiosity had already arrested his attention before I had entered the room. "You are later than usual, Watson," he said without looking up. "I stopped by the chemist's. Mrs. Turner's boy has taken a chill," I replied. "How you managed to deduce my tardiness from a rustling newspaper remains a mystery." "It wasn't the paper," he said, with a faint smile. "The smell of eucalyptus oil lingers on your cuff." Before I could offer any retort, there came the sound of steady footsteps upon the stairs, followed by the ever-dependable rapping of Mrs. Hudson at the door. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "No return address, and rather odd in the naming, if I may say so." Holmes accepted the envelope from her with a glance. It was plain, ivory-hued, and entirely unmarked, save for a single line scrawled in type across the front, "To the one who knows." Holmes turned it over with mild curiosity before producing his penknife and slicing the seal. He unfolded the sheet within and held it up to the light. He murmured. "Most intriguing." I rose and stood behind him, reading the contents over his shoulder. "Mr. Holmes, at precisely 11:47 p.m. this evening, the Fabergé egg, the winter blossom, housed within the east wing of the British Museum, will be stolen. The guards will be uninjured, and no trace of forced entry will be found. Your presence is welcome, though you may prefer to observe rather than intervene. Consider this an invitation, or a test. A fellow student of the method." There was a silence between us for several moments. Holmes' expression remained unreadable as he refolded the paper with care and placed it upon the mantel. "A jest?" I ventured. "A prank by one of your less stable admirers?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "Possibly. The tone is cultivated, the phrasing precise. This is no idle schoolboy. Whoever wrote it knows me or believes they do." I moved to examine the envelope more closely. "Typed, that's unusual." "Yes, but not damning. Many prefer the anonymity of the typewriter. It shields the tremor of the hand, the flourishes of character. But notice this, Watson, the alignment is imperfect. The letter E rises ever so slightly, a fault common to the Remington Standard No. 2. You think you've seen this machine before?" "I think I may have," he replied. "But what interests me more is the exactitude of the time, 11:47. Why not simply midnight? Why such specificity?" He rose suddenly, a gleam of excitement flickering in his eyes, the same look I had seen countless times before when the scent of mystery caught his finely tuned faculties. "I believe, Watson," he said as he reached for his coat and cane, "we shall be visiting the British Museum tonight. And the egg, I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. Let us see whether our anonymous correspondent is a prophet or merely a clever fraud. Chapter 2. The Egg Vanishes. That evening found us standing before the imposing facade of the British Museum, its great Ionic columns rising like solemn sentinels against the dimming sky. We were admitted discreetly through the staff entrance by a Mr. Allerton, the assistant curator of antiquities, a nervous man who gripped his ring of keys as if it were a crucifix. Holmes had wasted little time that afternoon. While I made inquiries into the provenance of the Fabergé egg in question, the Winter Blossom, one of only 6 known pieces commissioned by a lesser Russian countess, Holmes had tracked down a handful of museum staff whose schedules corresponded with the predicted event. He had questioned 3 guards, a janitor, and the museum's lighting engineer, all under the pretense of a security audit ordered by the Yard. None had aroused his suspicion, though I knew better than to mistake his silence for certainty. Inside the east wing, the gallery was empty but for ourselves and 2 night watchmen, both of whom had been instructed to behave as if nothing were amiss. Holmes had taken pains to ensure that their routines were not disturbed, for, as he put it, we must allow the mechanism to run unmolested if we wish to see the clock strike. The Fabergé egg rested within a glass case at the centre of a small, velvet-draped pedestal. It was exquisite. Not much larger than a goose egg, it shimmered under the lamplight in a delicate pattern of white enamel, with frost-like tracery of silver and pale blue sapphires curling across its surface. A tiny platinum clasp, shaped like a blooming snowdrop, adorned the top. I caught Holmes observing the display with narrowed eyes, not admiring the craftsmanship, but calculating angles, reflections, and sightlines as a chess master studies a board. "It is too exposed," he murmured, almost to himself. "A child with a rock could shatter it." "It hasn't happened yet," I offered. Holmes did not reply. He was already scanning the corners of the room, the edges of the skylights, the ornamental grilles beneath the ceiling mouldings. At precisely 11 o'clock, he selected a bench at the far end of the gallery, settled into it with the serenity of a man at the opera, and folded his long hands over his cane. I joined him, though the cold in the hall seemed to seep into my bones. Time passed slowly. The only sounds were the soft footfalls of the guards and the occasional creak of timber as the building adjusted to the night. Holmes remained entirely still, eyes fixed on the egg, unblinking. I watched the minute hand of my pocket watch crawl ever closer to the appointed time, 11:47. At exactly 11:46 the room felt different. Though the temperature remained the same, I was struck by an inexplicable sensation, as if we were not alone. A subtle sound, almost imperceptible, reached my ears, a faint clicking like the winding of a watch, followed by a sharp pop, and then darkness. The lights had gone out, not a gradual dimming nor a flicker, simply darkness, total and complete, for perhaps 3 seconds. Then the backup gas lamps engaged, flaring with a hiss. Holmes was already on his feet. We raced to the glass case, arriving just behind one of the guards who stood gaping in confusion. The egg was gone. The glass remained intact. There were no signs of tampering, no shattered remnants, no hurried footprints. Only the empty velvet cushion, slightly indented where the object had once sat. "Lights!" Holmes snapped. "The original circuit." Allerton came rushing in from the corridor with the engineer behind him, both pale as ghosts. Holmes took the engineer aside and began firing questions at rapid pace about circuits, timers, redundancies, recent inspections. I knelt beside the pedestal. The case was sealed with a brass latch, untouched, but the lock itself showed the faintest mark of recent contact, a smear No, a faint crescent of dark residue. Holmes was at my side in seconds. "Grease," he said, inhaling. "Machinery oil, not from the museum systems, imported." He turned sharply. "Mr. Allerton, how many keys exist for this case?" "Only 3, Mr. Holmes. One with the security chief, one in our vault, and one kept by the exhibit's overseer, Mr. Falk." "And where is Mr. Falk?" "Abroad, in Geneva. He left last week for a conference." Holmes stared at the empty case with deep concentration. He produced a lens from his pocket and examined the base, muttering to himself. Then he straightened. "It was not a theft," he said flatly. "It was a substitution." I looked at him, baffled. "But the egg is missing." "Indeed, but I suspect it was not removed at 11:47. It was replaced days ago, perhaps longer. What we saw vanish tonight was not the real egg, but a decoy." "A decoy that vanished into thin air?" "No, a decoy that vanished through means theatrical rather than magical. The brief outage was engineered to create a sense of drama, to anchor the prediction in our minds. But the true theft occurred earlier, silent, careful, unobserved. The letter was not a prophecy, it was a performance. But who would go to such lengths? Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned toward the door, then paused. "Who indeed, Watson? Someone who knows not just how I think, but how I prefer to be challenged." He turned to Allerton and instructed him to lock the room and permit no one to enter without police supervision. "I shall write to Inspector Lestrade," he said. "This is no ordinary theft. We are not chasing a criminal tonight, Watson. We are chasing an intellect, and I fear it is one that very much wishes to be caught." Chapter 3. A Shadow Imitator. The morning following the museum incident, Holmes was in a state I had not seen for some time, a mood of intense absorption tempered by a trace of unease. He paced our rooms with long, deliberate strides, pausing only to tap the mantelpiece or leaf through his clipping scrapbooks. Not a word passed between us until nearly 10 o'clock, when Mrs. Hudson delivered a second envelope. This one was no less curious than the first. It bore the same plain paper, the same anonymous typewriting, only this time the envelope was addressed to the mind behind the curtain. Holmes tore it open with a brisk flick of his fingers and scanned the contents. His brow furrowed and the corner of his mouth twitched upward, not in amusement, but recognition. "Well, Watson," he said finally, holding the page aloft, "our correspondent is not finished." I took the letter, reading aloud. "To the mind behind the curtain. One event is a curiosity. 2 become intention. At precisely 3:14 this afternoon, a gentleman seated in the reading room of the Diogenes Club will die. Natural causes will be assumed. You may catch the culprit, though I suspect you will be watching the wrong hands. Yours in the art of precision, a fellow student of the method." I looked up, chilled. "That's today." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "And the Diogenes Club, no less." "Your brother's club?" He nodded. "Mycroft will not be pleased, but the note is precise. The time, 3:14. The place, an institution of silence and observation. There is a reason the scene was chosen." "And the manner of death?" I asked. "Unspecified," Holmes said. "That is the most cunning part. The egg's disappearance involved misdirection, the illusion of timing. I suspect this letter follows the same structure. The act may already be in motion." Without another word, Holmes retrieved his gloves and coat, checked the charge in his revolver, and turned to me. "You'll come?" "Of course." We arrived at the Diogenes Club just after noon, having sent a wire ahead to Mycroft to ensure our entry. The doorman, used to the elder Holmes's gravity and presence, admitted us without ceremony. Inside, the atmosphere was as I remembered it, quiet as a mausoleum, draped in books, cigars, and disdain for conversation. The reading room, an expanse of high-backed chairs, oak panelling, and scattered newspapers, was half occupied, its members ensconced in broadsheets or dozing under lamplight. Mycroft greeted us with the faintest flicker of irritation in his expression. "I hope this is worth the interruption," he said, not rising from his seat. Holmes offered a thin smile. "You may wish to remain seated regardless." He then began a slow walk about the perimeter of the room, eyeing each gentleman in turn. A judge, a bishop, a retired admiral, no one suspicious, nothing out of place, until Holmes paused at a side table where a lean, bearded man in his 50s was reading a copy of the Times. Holmes stood very still. "Watson," he murmured, "observe his fingertips." I did as instructed. The man held the paper delicately with gloved hands. Odd in itself, but more so was the faint orange tinge at the base of his gloves. Nicotine, I guessed. Perhaps. Or something more exotic. Holmes moved on without confrontation. We took our seats at the edge of the room and waited. The tall grandfather clock struck 3. The room remained still. A few members stirred. One gentleman folded his paper, yawned, and adjusted his spectacles. At precisely 3:14, the bearded man rose from his chair, crossed the room, and collapsed. It was sudden, silent, and definitive. Chairs scraped. Several men rose. Holmes reached the man first, kneeling beside him. I followed, checking the pulse. "Gone," I confirmed. Holmes looked at the face, no sign of pain. The eyes open, untroubled. A club steward arrived, gasping. "Doctor?" "Fetch a police constable," Holmes said, "and seal the reading room. No one leaves." He turned to me. "You noticed his gloves?" "Yes, still on." Holmes slipped one from the man's hand. Underneath, the fingers were stained faintly blue. "Cyanide compound," he said quietly. "Absorbed through the skin, most likely. A delivery method that would pass unnoticed. He was the target." "But how did the killer apply it without contact?" "That," Holmes said, rising slowly, "is the brilliance. The gloves were not the weapon, they were the warning. I believe the man was already exposed, perhaps days ago. What we witnessed was the timing, not the act. And the letter predicted it precisely." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he looked down at the corpse. "I know this man," he said. "Colonel Forsyth. He testified in a case I once studied, accused a clever forger of near-criminal imitation, a man named Elias Varn. Was he convicted? Acquitted. Disappeared shortly after." I felt a chill not from the room. "You think this Varn is behind these letters?" Holmes stared into space. "No, I think someone learned from him, perhaps even surpassed him." Chapter 4. The Gentleman in the Library. The days following Colonel Forsyth's mysterious death passed with a strange hush about them, as though the very city itself were listening. Holmes became wholly consumed, his usual bursts of violin playing and acidic commentary replaced by extended silence and intervals of rapid note-taking. When he spoke, it was only to ask for a directory, a map of the museum's security access, or, for reasons not immediately clear, a list of registered typewriter repairs within the past year. I observed all of this in silence. Though he frequently spoke to me of trifling deductions, I sensed that Holmes's mind was straining against something vast and unspoken. The deaths, the disappearances, they were not random acts of criminality, but components of a system Holmes had yet to fully apprehend. Then on the 4th morning, he looked up from his notes and said simply, "We are being baited." "By whom?" I asked. "By someone who understands the rhythm of a case, who knows the satisfaction of deduction, the false security of the halfway answer. This is not merely a criminal mind, Watson. It is a narrative one." Before I could question this remark, Mrs. Hudson entered with yet another envelope. This one was a pale grey, slightly heavier than the last, and sealed with a curious wax stamp in the shape of a question mark. "To the listener in the dark," Holmes read aloud, with a raised brow. He opened it with a flick of the letter opener. "Mr. Holmes, since museums and clubs have failed to deter your steps, perhaps a quieter setting will suffice. Tonight, the Cambridge Library. A theft will occur, though not of an object. Watch closely. Midnight, precisely. A fellow student of the method." "A theft," I repeated. "But not of an object?" "Which means," Holmes said, rising, "we are not to lose a thing, but perhaps a man, a memory, or a truth." We arrived at the Cambridge Library in Russell Square shortly after 10 that evening. Holmes had made arrangements with the head librarian, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Clench, who had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to grant us full access to the building after hours. The library was an ancient place of knowledge, its oak shelves bowing slightly under the weight of centuries. Holmes walked the length of the central aisle slowly, peering down each corridor, every nook and gallery. Occasionally he paused to adjust the angle of a mirror or note the placement of a floorboard. At 5 minutes to midnight, we took our places in the third-floor balcony overlooking the central rotunda. Below us, a single man was seated beneath a green-shaded lamp. He was well dressed, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair slicked back and a book open before him. His fingers turned the pages with mechanical precision. Holmes passed me a pair of field glasses. "Who is he?" I whispered. "I do not know," Holmes replied. "But he is the only person who has entered the library in the last hour, and he matches none of the staff or the evening readers." "You believe he is our thief?" "No, I believe he is our clue." The clock struck 12. The man below did not move. A minute passed, then another, and then quietly, without any sign of disturbance, the man below closed his book, rose from the table, and walked directly to the rear wall. With surprising calm, he placed a hand on the wainscoting and pressed inward. A narrow seam appeared. A panel swung open. Holmes stiffened beside me. "A hidden door," he murmured. "Built into the wall. Not on any plans I've seen." The man disappeared into the dark. The panel shut behind him. We raced down the spiral staircase and crossed the marble floor. Holmes pressed his palms against the same section of wall, but it did not budge. "No mechanism," he muttered, "or it's on a timer." He knocked twice. Solid wood. Then he turned, scanning the room. His eyes fell on the book the man had been reading. It lay open on the table, face down. Holmes approached it, flipped it gently, then paused. Volume 4 of Macaulay's History of England, page bookmarked. He read the passage aloud. "An imposture long undetected is a proof not of stupidity, but of genius." Holmes did not speak for a full minute. Then, "This was not a theft of an object, Watson. It was a theft of place. That man does not belong in this building, and yet he passed unnoticed into a space that is not meant to exist." "You believe he planted the letter?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No, he was the letter." Chapter 5. The Man Who Wasn't There. For all his accustomed reserve, Holmes was unusually quiet on our return to Baker Street. He sat for nearly an hour in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on some invisible point above the hearth. When at last he stirred, it was to rise, retrieve an atlas from the shelf, and consult a map of central London. "The library, the museum, the Diogenes Club," he murmured. "3 points forming a narrow triangle. But it is the centre of that triangle that interests me." He drew a small dot in the midst of the paper. "Red Lion Passage," I said, leaning over. Holmes nodded. A quiet alley. No institutions of note. No reason for our adversary to focus there, unless he trailed off, then closed the atlas with a snap. Come, Watson. If the answers won't come to us, we shall go to them. Red Lion Passage is not a place a gentleman lingers by choice. Tucked behind Holborn and wedged between two crumbling warehouses, it consists of uneven cobbles, rain-darkened brick, and the perpetual scent of coal smoke and stagnant water. We arrived just past midday, the sun weak and high, though the alley remained cloaked in a peculiar gloom. It was Holmes who first noticed the door. Set into the base of an old printing shop, it bore no signage, only a brass knob polished far too cleanly for the surrounding neglect. Holmes examined it with care, brushing away a cobweb and testing the hinges. "It was opened recently," he said. "See the scrape marks and the faint boot tread here, no larger than size 8. Without hesitation, he turned the knob. Inside, the passage gave way to a narrow staircase that descended into a dim cellar, the walls lined with dust-laden shelves. A rusted oil lamp hung from the rafters, casting uneven light. But it was not the cellar's decrepitude that drew Holmes' attention. It was the wall of mirrors at its end. Each one was slightly warped, mismatched in frame and size. Some bore fine cracks, others reflected nothing at all but shadow. But upon closer inspection I noticed something deeply disquieting. The mirrors were not facing outward. They were angled inward, toward a single wooden chair placed at the center of the room. Holmes stepped lightly into the circle, studying each surface. "Not for vanity," he murmured, "not surveillance, reflection." He pointed to the floor beneath the chair. "See this ring, the scuff marks around it? The chair has been rotated." I shivered. "But why arrange such a thing?" "To study the self," Holmes said quietly, "or to become someone else." We found little else, only a scattered stack of handwritten pages resting on a crate. Holmes examined one under his lens. "The same phrasing," he muttered. "See the cadence of the sentences, the exact precision of cause and effect. This is not mere writing, it is mimicry." "Of whom?" I asked. "Of me, Watson." He turned the page, and I caught sight of the first line. The client was already speaking as I entered, though I had yet to step across the threshold. Her perfume, lemon verbena and old dust, placed her in Islington, unmarried, with a recently deceased pet bird. It read like something Holmes himself might dictate, clinical, confident, and laced with the rhythm of deduction. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "You're being copied." "Not just copied," Holmes replied grimly. "Imitated. Someone is practicing being me." At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stair above. Holmes extinguished the lamp. We drew into the shadows. A man entered, slim, well dressed in an overcoat, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He paused before the mirrors, adjusted his cuffs, and sat in the chair. Holmes placed a finger to his lips. We watched in breathless silence as the man reached into his coat and withdrew something startling, a prosthetic nose and a false moustache which he affixed with swift precision. Then, in a low, measured voice, he began to speak aloud. To the mirrors. "You see, Watson, the dust on his shoes was not from London at all. It was coal soot, of the sort only found along the Welsh border." I turned to Holmes, stunned. "He's rehearsing being you." Holmes whispered, "And not badly either." But in that moment, the man froze mid-sentence, his eyes shifting slightly toward the mirror to his left. He rose. Holmes seized my arm. "He's seen something." We made to intercept him, but the man bolted for the stairs with unnatural speed. By the time we reached the street, he had vanished into the maze of alleyways, leaving behind only a faint scent of bergamot and ash. Holmes stood in the grey light, unmoving. "A mimic," he said softly. "But not for performance." "For what then?" Holmes turned toward me, and for the first time since the case began, I saw the faintest trace of alarm in his eyes. "For infiltration, Watson." Chapter 6. The Imitation Game. Holmes had always claimed that the surest sign of a great mind at work was the sense of unease it produced in others, not through fear or spectacle, but through the precision with which it exposed their own assumptions. By that measure, the letter left on Lestrade's desk had been written by no ordinary man. "To the man who sees through locks," Holmes repeated under his breath as we rode in a hansom back from Scotland Yard. He held the envelope in one gloved hand, turning it slowly in the fading afternoon light. "It's not merely a riddle, it's a taunt, a naming." "Do you think he was inside the yard himself?" I asked. Holmes tapped the edge of the letter thoughtfully. "Undoubtedly, and he left through the front door, unnoticed, unchallenged, because he was likely wearing a badge and a name not his own." "He could impersonate an officer?" "He can impersonate me, Watson," Holmes said sharply. "The rest is child's play by comparison." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the letter out across his desk beside the earlier two. He studied the typing, spacing, alignment, indentations. "No two are identical," he muttered. "Yet they speak in a single voice, which tells me something." He stood. "Come with me." "To where?" "To someone who used to be me." We arrived shortly after dusk at a bookshop in Clerkenwell, a place Holmes once used to gather underground pamphlets and foreign publications. The shop was dim, sparsely stocked, and manned by a gaunt, bespectacled clerk with ink-stained fingers and a habit of speaking in half-whispers. "Evening, Mr. Blake," Holmes greeted him. "Still collecting private case reports?" Blake blinked. "You've been copied again, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled tightly. "So I suspected." From behind the counter, Blake produced a file. "One of your impersonators. Bought up half the pink suitcase casebook, your newspaper write-up, the police files, even the foreign language reprints." Holmes flipped through it. "Anything strange?" Blake hesitated. "He never paid with the same currency twice. One day francs, next day rubles, then shillings, and he never used the same name twice either." Holmes looked up sharply. "He wore me like a costume." "More like a study," Blake said, "as if he were learning you." We left the shop with the file under Holmes's arm. In the fog-drenched street a carriage passed by, and Holmes froze momentarily, his eyes narrowing. "Did you see that?" "See what?" "The man inside, briefly. He had my face, or something very close to it. He broke into a sprint, darting after the carriage, weaving between startled pedestrians. By the time I caught up, Holmes stood in a narrow street, breathing heavily. The carriage had vanished. He turned to me. "I tell you, Watson, I felt as though I'd glimpsed myself from the outside." We walked back in silence. Back at Baker Street, the fire crackled as Holmes stood over the hearth, the three letters spread before him. "I understand now," he said, eyes alight. "He studies my language, my methods, my relationships. But more than that, he mimics my presence. Not just what I deduce, but how I make others feel." He paced. He did not break into the yard to steal secrets. He left the note to prove he could stand where I stand, unseen, unchallenged, already inside the circle. He stopped pacing. "That's the game, Watson, a long imitation, and the next move is no longer a rehearsal. It will be a test, one so precise, so calculated, that it will force the world to ask a question I have never invited." "What question?" Holmes turned to me slowly. His voice was low, deliberate. What if the real Sherlock Holmes is no longer the best? Chapter 7. The Shapeshifter's Letter. It arrived the next morning, not by post nor by courier, but folded carefully between the pages of the Times, delivered as usual by the paperboy, who swore he had received nothing out of the ordinary. Mrs. Hudson was none the wiser. Holmes, however, knew at once. "This," he said, holding it up with a pair of tongs, "is not a message for the police. It is a message for me alone." The envelope bore no address, no stamp, just a wax seal, black, imprinted with a single initial, S. He cracked it open. The paper inside was heavier than the previous letters, watermarked, rich, purposeful. Holmes laid it flat on the table, weighed its corners with his magnifying glass and snuff-box, then leaned over in silence to read. I did not interrupt. At last he spoke, his voice cold and steady. "He has made his intention clear." He slid the page toward me. "To Sherlock Holmes, you must be growing tired of chasing echoes, old friend. You must be wondering why each step you take feels rehearsed. It is because it was, by me. You do not know my name, but you've met me many times, in the anxious gaze of a suspect, in the admiring student, in the criminal who begged your attention. I have been learning from you for years, Holmes. Not the mannerisms or the deductions, that was child's play. I mean the essence of you. How you command silence in a room. How you manipulate the moment. How you disappear in plain sight. In precisely 72 hours, I will solve a crime of such intricacy and notoriety that the world will believe it was you who solved it, and they will thank me. You may still chase shadows if you wish, but you are no longer the author of your own story. Signed, S., the Shapeshifter. I set the letter down with a shiver. "Madness," I said quietly. "This is obsession. It reads like a manifesto." Holmes didn't respond at once. He walked to the window and looked out across the rooftops of Baker Street, his hands folded behind his back. After a long silence, he spoke. "He intends to become me in the eyes of the public." "Do you think he'll succeed?" Holmes turned, eyes sharp. "That depends on whether I let him choose the stage." He returned to the letter and pointed to a line. "I will solve a crime." "That implies foreknowledge," Holmes said. "It may already be committed, or, more disturbingly, about to be. Can we stop him?" Holmes frowned. "We can interrupt his plan, yes, but to destroy it, Watson, we must go further." "How?" "By doing what he cannot, by being me without becoming him." He walked over to the bureau and retrieved a slim, black notebook, his personal ledger of unsolved curiosities, oddities too incomplete to justify full investigation. He flipped through the pages swiftly, then stopped. "This one," he said. "The missing boy in Lambeth." The details were too strange to dismiss. A vanished body, conflicting alibis, and a curious fingerprint of soot on the ceiling. I leaned in. "You think this is the crime he means to solve?" Holmes nodded. "It's just obscure enough to go unnoticed. Until it is solved, public sympathy will soar, the case will make headlines. And if he appears first, before me, if he deduces it in public, they'll believe he's Sherlock Holmes." Holmes closed the book with a snap. "Then we must solve it first, not for pride, but to preserve the truth." He picked up his coat and turned to me with that familiar glint in his eye, half danger, half delight. "Come, Watson, we go to Lambeth. The imitation ends tonight." Chapter 8. The Double Crime. Lambeth had never been known for charm, but that night, under a leaden sky and streets still slick from earlier rain, it wore a darker face. The gas lamps burned low, smothered by fog. Children's laughter was absent. What remained was silence, disturbed only by the distant clang of factory iron and the echo of our own footsteps. Holmes had barely spoken during the journey south. His eyes remained half-closed, as if replaying each move the shapeshifter might make before making it himself. "The missing boy?" I prompted. "What do we know?" Holmes answered without looking at me. "Name, Elias Bell. Age, 12, went missing 4 nights ago. Last seen leaving a night lesson in arithmetic 8:10. No witnesses, no ransom, no remains." "And the soot on the ceiling?" "A fingerprint upside down, found above the boy's bed, too high for a child, too clear to be accidental." We arrived at a row of tight, grim brick homes, all windows shuttered despite the hour. A constable stood outside number 14, hat in hand, eyes widening at the sight of Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, stepping aside. Inside, the boy's mother met us. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clenched in the folds of her dress. "Elias was a good boy," she murmured. "Bright, far too bright for this place. Said he wanted to be like the man in the newspapers, like you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes bowed his head, visibly moved, though he said nothing. She led us upstairs. The boy's room was simple: a bed, a writing desk, stacks of books far beyond his years, and above the headboard, just as reported, a single black fingerprint pressed against the plaster like a mark of ownership. Holmes approached it with care, examining not the mark itself, but the angle, the dust around it, the shape of the disturbed particles. After several minutes, he stepped back. "Left hand," he murmured. "Index finger dipped in chimney soot." The print wasn't made by someone reaching up, but by someone descending. "From the ceiling?" I asked, incredulous. "No, from the loft above it." Holmes yanked the cord to the ceiling hatch and climbed without waiting. I followed, clumsily. The crawl space above was tight, filled with old trunks and insulation. And there, amid the cobwebs, was something chilling. A folded page of the Times, the same issue that had been delivered to us that morning. "Good Lord," I said. "He was here." Holmes said nothing. He held the paper with a handkerchief and turned it gently. There, in the fold, was a torn scrap of a letter, the same paper as before, typed, no salutation, no signature. "He was bright. You would have liked him. We had a long talk. About you." Holmes exhaled slowly, and for the first time I saw real anger flash in his eyes. Back on the street, we hurried toward the station to speak with the child's instructor. But as we reached the corner, a shrill whistle pierced the air. 2 constables ran past us, shouting, "There's been a fire! A man found dead, up by Gray's Alley!" Holmes stopped abruptly. Gray's Alley? That's less than 2 streets from where the boy vanished. Without another word, we turned and followed the smoke. The scene was chaos. A 1-room let above a cobbler's shop had gone up in flames. The fire had been contained, but a single charred body remained within, discovered tied to a chair, a gag in his mouth, wrists scorched. Holmes pushed past the cordon. "Let me in." Lestrade, already on scene, looked up in surprise. "Holmes! How in the devil—" "No time," Holmes snapped. Inside, the scorched room told a horrid story. The victim's face was unrecognizable, but his clothes remained partially intact, fine wool, the buttons marked with the crest of a gentleman's club in Mayfair. "Who is he?" I asked. Holmes stooped and picked up a glint of metal near the corpse. A monocle, cracked but familiar. "Colonel Trench," Holmes murmured. "Our gentleman in the library." "But he was part of the earlier misdirection," I said. "What is he doing here?" Holmes pointed to the victim's left hand, 4 fingers curled, the index stiffly extended in the direction of the desk. On the desk sat another letter. Holmes opened it. 2 crimes, 2 versions, One man will solve them. The world will decide who it believes. Let the trial begin. Beneath it was a list of dates. The most recent was tomorrow's, and beside it, a single word: kidnapping. Holmes paled. It's not over, it's beginning again. Outside, as the crowds gathered and the constables jotted statements, Holmes stood very still. The shapeshifter is no longer emulating me, he said. He's writing his own narrative, using crimes as punctuation marks. These events aren't random, Watson. They are lines in a script in which he plays Sherlock Holmes, and I'm merely a footnote. And what do we do? Holmes turned to me. We will rewrite the ending. Chapter 9. The Trial of Two Detectives. The next day dawned with grim finality. Even the skies seemed to sense it, grey, low-hanging, thick with unshed rain. Holmes was silent through breakfast, refusing his usual pipe and tea. He stood by the window in his dressing gown, scanning the front page of every major newspaper with an intensity I had seen only in moments of true peril. And there it was. Boy found alive in Soho, anonymous tip, leads police to basement hideaway. Below the headline, a photograph of Elias Bell, frightened but unharmed, being carried from a dingy tenement. The boy was wrapped in a woolen coat, not just any coat, one that had once belonged to Sherlock Holmes. God in heaven, I breathed. He's done it. Holmes didn't answer. He only tapped the ink-smudged page. Read the byline, I did. As relayed to this paper by an anonymous detective present at the scene. Beneath it, a familiar phrase. Elementary, I believe. My heart sank. By midday, the story had gripped the entire city. The public, always eager for spectacle, now found itself caught between two legends, one established, one emerging. Holmes's name began to appear in tandem with headlines bearing strange qualifications, alleged, possibly involved, as claimed by sources. And through it all, Holmes said nothing. He donned his coat and gloves with mechanical precision. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To end this before it begins," he said. The boy was never the objective, nor the colonel. They were bait. He wants the final confrontation, and he wants it public. He handed me a card, a stark white invitation, delivered hours earlier by a street urchin who remembered nothing of the man who gave it to him. The Criterion Theatre, 8 o'clock sharp, one night only, a deduction in 2 acts. Witness the impossible, believe the unbelievable, choose your Holmes. The Criterion Theatre, lit like a jewel box in the fog, was already teeming with curious onlookers. Tickets had sold out within hours, though no one knew who had paid for the performance. We entered through a side door, escorted by a stone-faced usher who spoke only once. He asked that you come alone to the stage before the curtain rises. Inside the wings, Holmes turned to me. "No matter what you see, Watson, say nothing until I ask you, promise me." I nodded. He disappeared into the dark. The curtain rose at precisely 8. A hushed audience stared in collective disbelief as the stage revealed 2 sitting figures, identical in silhouette. 2 men in dark suits, 2 aquiline profiles, 2 sharp gazes beneath arched brows. Holmes sat on the right. The man on the left wore the same coat, the same collar, even mimicked the tilt of the head. His voice, when it came, was astonishing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the audience, "we present you with a challenge." The voice was Holmes's voice, his rhythm, his accent, his presence. A theft, a murder, a child found, 3 mysteries, 3 conclusions, but only one of us solved them, the other merely observed. The audience murmured. Holmes rose slowly. "I do not intend to argue," he said evenly. "I will demonstrate." He stepped forward and launched into a deduction, brilliant, cutting, lightning quick. He described the front row of the audience in surgical detail, the judge with ink on his cuff from signing a late warrant, the shopkeeper with oil under his nails from a last-minute repair, the socialite who had changed earrings mid-carriage. They applauded. The theatre buzzed. Then the impostor stood and did the same, just as fast, just as precise, but different. Where Holmes cut with a scalpel, this man performed. He made deductions like a magician pulling scarves from his sleeve, flourishes, laughter, theatrics. The crowd adored him. Holmes watched, unmoved. Then the final act began. A constable brought out a sealed box. Inside, a pocketbook found at the scene of the colonel's death. Neither Holmes had seen it. It would be the decider. Each man was asked to deduce its owner. The impostor went first, flawless deductions, perfectly logical. Then Holmes took the book, opened it, and said just one sentence. "This is not the colonel's." Gasps. "How do you know?" asked the moderator. Holmes held up the inside cover. "Because it contains a pressed flower, and Trench was violently allergic to pollen, a fact no one but his physician and I knew." Stunned silence. The other Holmes faltered, just for a breath. Then the faintest flicker in his expression. The theatre erupted, not into applause, but confusion. Half the crowd was still unconvinced. The impostor bowed with a flourish and disappeared behind the curtain as constables moved in. Holmes turned to me. "He wanted more than to replace me," he whispered. "He wanted to divide belief, to prove that truth no longer matters, only performance." Outside, the shapeshifter escaped into the fog. A pursuit began, but it would not end quickly. He had spent years studying Holmes. He knew when to vanish. But now the world had seen him. And more importantly, he had blinked. Chapter 10. The Man Who Wasn't Me. The manhunt lasted 5 days. Not a long time by the standards of London's most elusive criminals, but this was no ordinary fugitive. This was someone who had learned to anticipate the very act of pursuit. Every trick Holmes had used in the past was now being deployed against him. Dead ends, lookalikes, misdirections as elegant as they were maddening. But Holmes did not chase. He watched, he waited, and finally he baited the hook. It began with a letter published openly in the Times, penned by Holmes himself. An unprecedented move. "To the man who would be me, I invite you home. There is one deduction you have not yet made, and it awaits you at tomb 21B. Come see if you can spot it before I do." He signed it simply. S.H. I objected, of course. "You're inviting him into Baker Street. You're putting your name, your reputation, your life on the line." Holmes merely lit a match and touched it to his pipe. "He cannot resist," he said. "He needs me to witness his triumph, and he'll need to prove, above all, that he's cleverer in my own domain." "And if he is?" Holmes glanced toward the door. "Then I deserve to lose." The shapeshifter arrived 2 nights later. He came dressed in charcoal grey, no disguise, no theatrics, just the man as he truly was. His face was sharp but unremarkable, his eyes devoid of warmth. Still there was something unnerving about him, the poise, the stillness, the faint echo of Holmes in his every motion. "Dr. Watson?" he greeted, nodding as if we were old acquaintances. "And of course, Mr. Holmes." Holmes said nothing. He motioned to the chair across from him, the same chair where Lestrade, Adler, and Moriarty had once sat. The man accepted it like a king receiving a throne. "So," the shapeshifter said softly, "what is the deduction I have not yet made?" Holmes folded his hands. "You tell me." A slow smile curled across the man's face. "There is nothing in this room I do not know. Every photograph, every crack in the ceiling, every thread, in that tattered rug. I even know the contents of the violin case, yes, including the unfinished manuscript in E minor. Holmes raised an eyebrow, amused. Impressive, but you overlooked something. The shapeshifter leaned forward. What? Holmes stood and retrieved a framed photograph from the mantel. He turned it around. The image was recent. Elias Bell, the boy from Lambeth, smiling beside his mother. I returned to the Bell household this morning, Holmes said. The boy was drawing, a man, tall, pale, wore my coat, carried a small bottle in his hand, chloroform most likely, and in the corner of the page, without prompting, he'd written something. He handed over a second paper. A child's handwriting. Uneven but clear. The man who took me smelled like limes. And he was scared. The shapeshifter stiffened. You see, Holmes continued, you may know how I think, how I deduce. You may even know how I present myself, but you'll never know how I feel. You've mimicked intellect. But fear? Guilt? You can't erase them. The boys smelled them on you. I don't. You're not me, Holmes said, standing. You're the man who wasn't me. And now you've made your final mistake. You stepped out of the shadows and into a child's memory, and children remember what matters. The door burst open. Lestrade and two officers entered, pistols raised. The shapeshifter didn't fight. He merely sat back and smiled. I still won, he said softly. The world doubted you. They doubted truth. Holmes looked down at him. Perhaps. But doubt is temporary. Facts remain. As the man was led away, Holmes turned to the fire and dropped the invitation letter, the one that had lured the impostor. It curled in the flames. Gone. Later that night, the silence of Baker Street felt deeper than usual. I broke it. Did you mean what you said? That he wasn't evil, just empty? Holmes looked into the fire for a long while. He was a reflection, but not of me, of what the world wants genius to be. Sharp, showy, cold. He thought impersonation was mastery, but he misunderstood the weight of conscience. And what now? I asked. You've cleared your name, proven your identity. Holmes smiled faintly. Identity is not proven, Watson. It is lived, day by day, case by case. He reached for his violin and drew the bow slowly across the strings. A low, solemn note filled the room. Outside, the fog wrapped tighter around the gas lamps of London, but inside 2 and 21B stood warm and clear. Holmes was home, and the shadow had passed. Epilogue. It was nearly a fortnight after the incident at the Criterion Theatre when we received official word. The man known only as the shapeshifter had been positively identified as Sebastian Rowe, a disgraced former criminologist with a history of obsessive mimicry and falsified credentials. His trial was brief. The mountain of evidence collected, including forged notes, stolen garments, and eyewitness accounts, was insurmountable. The jury found him guilty on all counts: kidnapping, obstruction of justice, impersonation of a public figure, and the unlawful endangerment of a minor. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The newspapers printed his true name once, and then moved on. As quickly as he had risen to notoriety, he vanished from public consciousness, forgotten by a world eager for novelty. As for Holmes, he returned to his routine with characteristic precision. Though quieter than usual in the weeks that followed, he eventually resumed his cases, his violin, and his midnight musings. The locked drawer containing the shapeshifter's letters remained unopened, but untouched not out of fear, but because Holmes no longer needed to read them. "I knew who he was before he arrived," Holmes said to me one evening. "Now the world knows it too. That is enough." And so, The curious case of the shapeshifter's letter came to an end, not with a gunshot or a fall from a cliff, but with a quiet verdict and the return of order to Baker Street. Some cases linger in the mind for years. Others are closed, filed, and left undisturbed. This was one of the latter. And that concludes the curious case of the shapeshifter's letter, a tale of identity, deception, and one man's quiet triumph over shadows cast in his name. From the heart of Baker Street to wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us. If this mystery stirred your imagination, please like the video, subscribe to the Drawing Room Detectives, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, because no matter how far you are, we're all sitting in the same armchair, unraveling the same threads.